for the first talk today in our series on our online talk series on history and methods in political economy. So just to quickly introduce the collaboration that has led to these talks. One is from the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies or Ideas, which is here, which has been established this year at OP Jindal Global University, where we are trying to create an environment to have more deeper engagements in in different areas, and we have various research constellations. So we are part of the Understanding Indian Economy research constellation, where we have different tracks that we are following. But one of the tracks that we want to focus on is bringing in history or history of economic thought, or just the history of economics as a discipline, as part of our one of the lines that we want to take. So we, in fact, our first event was in April, where we had a very engaging online day-long symposium on the history of Indian economic thought. And we want to carry this forward with this particular online series. Now, this is being done in collaboration with the also recently established Indian Society for History of Economic Thought, ISHET for short, which was formally established last year. And in fact, this year in October at Hyderabad University, we will be having the first annual ISHET conference, where we have found that there is significant interest in the history of economic thought, and there is a growing community in India. And I think we can also see that from the number of people who are interested to attend talks and events around this. So this is being held in collaboration together. In fact, some of us are also members of both Ideas and ISHET, and we are trying to work towards building this line of having just events and even further research along the track of history and economics, right? So with that, I'll hand it back to Ruchira, and we are eager to hear Mathew Forstater's talk today.
Hello. So for me, it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Matt Forstater. Over the years, I have with great trouble learned to call him Matt, where, as a good Indian student, I used to first call him Sir. Then I heard that was not done, so I would call him Dr. Forstater. And then after many years, I have learned to call him Matt. So Matt is a professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, my alma mater. And he's a research director of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He has published very widely on employment, budgetary policies, ecological economics, economics of discrimination, monetary history, theory, and policy. The list is very, very long if you choose to look it up. I will just give you some of my personal favorites amongst Matt's writings. First is Rishi. First is Taxation and Primitive Accumulation, the Case of Colonial Africa. The other, which I arguably like better because I read it later, is Tax-Driven Money, Additional Evidence from the History of Economic Thought. And finally, Bones for Sale, Development, Environment, and Food Security in East Africa. To all members of ISHET and Ideas, when you get the chance, please read these, particularly these three. Now over to you, Matt.
Thank you so much. You can hear me. So I so appreciate the invitation and the generous hospitality, and I want to extend my congratulations to Ideas and to ISHET. I'm very excited about everything that I hear that's going on in India, political economy and interdisciplinary social inquiry. I've been a long time admirer and student of many, say, Indian economic thought. And so it feels very, very feels comfortable for me to be collaborating. And of course, Ruchira Sen, Dr. Sen, she is, my teacher, even if she was a former student. And so I so appreciate. And so I'll share my screen. I have a few slides, and I'll try not to over do the presentation. Let's see. Are you able to see my screen?
Not yet. It will come in a minute. There's the share screen icon at the bottom, number 3. See if you can see
Right.
that.
Let's see. Okay. Well,
If it doesn't work, I can just download them and play them. Would that work? Yeah.
so you don't see my screen.
Not yet.
Okay.
But what
All
I
right.
do is I can download the ones you sent me earlier
Yeah.
and play those.
Okay, that would work. I mean, you can just share your screen if that works, and yeah, if you I guess put it on your
Oh, I've got some
yes.
Q&A. Oh, somebody's saying it's not audible. Polum is helping with that. Meanwhile, whoops, Rishi. Rishi, you don't have to be here. You can go and play and watch TV. I think he wants to be here.
I mean, also we could also proceed without the slides.
I'll pull them up. You can start and I'll just pull them
Okay,
up.
Matt, I
why
just
don't we?
changed something. Maybe try again. Just one last shot.
Okay, let's see here. Oh, okay. Um, well,
Oh, something's happening.
okay. Something's happening, and
Yeah, there you are.
okay, very nice. So, The Economist as poet and mathematician, Adolf Lowe, and instrumental inference. And Ruchir and I were speaking in the run up to the seminar, and we were talking a little bit about a certain tradition in the history of economic thought that Adolf Lowe, who his I guess biggest claim to fame in a sense is that he was Robert Heilbronner's teacher, mentor, and inspiration in many ways for Heilbronner's kind of conception of the classical economists and Marx as worldly philosophers, is the title of Heilbronner's famous book. And so readers of Heilbronner will perhaps be familiar with Adolf Lowe's name, which is mentioned throughout Heilbronner's writings, occasionally as the focus, but often just as a mention. So Lowe had a very fascinating life and career, which if you're interested, you can follow up on. But he lived to age 102, and he was working up until the last few years. And you might say that his three most important works were published after the age of 75, which gives us all hope. And so he adopted a methodological approach, which he called instrumentalism. A little unfortunate in maybe the choice of terminology, just because of it is not the same as Milton Friedman's instrumentalism, or even John Dewey's instrumentalism, although it is a little closer to John Dewey's. The main idea of instrumental analysis, which is part of what Lowe called his political economics, is that whereas in the conventional approach, the initial conditions are taken as given, or you have the data of your economic theory. In neoclassical economics, it would be preferences, technology, and endowments, right? And then the analysis is working forward from those given conditions, wherever it might lead. And Lowe proposed that we begin from our vision of where we want to go, the sustainable and just society and economy that we wish to create. And then from the vision of our goals, we work backwards, first to discover structural and technological paths that are sufficient to connect our goals back to where we are right now, or perhaps if not where we are right now, then a state within our reach through some policy interventions. And after we identify the structural and technological paths, then it's the behavior or behaviors that will set the system on these paths, or one of the paths that we select, and from behaviors back to motivations that are capable of inducing those behaviors, and from there to our present state, or a state within our reach. And so the idea really is that economics is, or should be, concerned with the means for attaining these independently given or stipulated goals. In other words, economics does not set the goals. This is actually different than what we are accustomed to, although at the same time, often instrumentalism is kind of present in the analytical systems of authors. They just sort of weren't completely aware of it, perhaps. So and a good example I feel, is, say, with the environment. So we have scientific information that say the assimilative capacity of the environment is capable of absorbing and transforming certain emissions into harmless forms per time period. So the assimilative capacity of the environment, which itself is a resource, right? So the traditional, say, in neoclassical environmental economics, either the Pigouvian or Coase, or these are all sort of different forms of cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis, so you end up, right, whatever the amount of pollution is, when the market is in equilibrium, is called the optimal level of pollution, right? When you have a similar optimal rate of resource depletion and these kinds of, you know, and there is no necessary relationship between the optimal level of pollution and the amount of emissions per time period the assimilative capacity is capable of absorbing. So if instead we set the cap of the emissions at a level that is consistent with the assimilative capacity, then that goal of having emissions below that amount is given from outside economics. It's from a scientifically informed, political process, hopefully democratic political process. But in any case, it's a politically stipulated set of goals, or in this case, a goal. And then economics, the role of economics is in finding the cost-effective means for the attainment of the goals that are given from outside the system. So, in several footnotes in his work trying to explain instrumental inference, Lowe cited the Hungarian mathematician and educator George Polya, who spent most of his career at Stanford. He wrote a classic little book called How to Solve It, which deals with what he calls heuristics, and which he defines as working backwards. And then also the pragmatist philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce's notion of retroduction, sometimes referred to as abduction, and people may be familiar with retroduction. For example, Tony Lawson, in his work that incorporated critical realism into post-Keynesian economics, drew on retroduction, and several other traditions also have tried to employ this idea of retroduction. And then Michael Polanyi, Karl Polanyi's brother. So Karl Polanyi, of course, the author of The Great Transformation, his brother, Michael Polanyi, was a physical chemist who then took up history and philosophy of science and social science. And Michael Polanyi, actually was a colleague of Adolf Loos at the University of Manchester in the 1930s for around 7 years. And they had actually an exchange in I think it was the Manchester Bulletin of Economics and Statistics about the economy of the Soviet Union at that time. But Polanyi is known best known for his idea of tacit knowledge. And we'll get into all three of these in a little bit of detail now. So first, with Polya's heuristics, he calls them the methods and rules of discovery and invention, that he refers to as working backwards. And he finds roots of this idea in the work of the Greek geometers, which this is what was referred to as analysis, whereas synthesis was working forwards. And working backwards and working forwards are not just either or choice. In fact, working backwards is the plan, and then working forwards is the execution of the plan. So analysis, working backwards, is the plan. Synthesis, the execution of the plan. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And likewise, Peirce's retroduction also can be seen as, rather than simply an alternative to induction or deduction, as complementary, that retroduction works together with induction and deduction. And Peirce considered retroduction to be the only type of inference capable of producing new knowledge. And he also referred to it as reasoning from consequent to antecedent, and inferring a cause from its effect. And that latter, by the way, Abba Lerner, for those who might be familiar with the modern money theory, drawing on Abba Lerner's functional finance. I mean, his primary idea of functional finance was that we are concerned with the effects of any particular, say, relationship between government spending and taxation, and the budget itself is just accounting information, and it's the results of any particular relationship between government spending and taxes that we're concerned with. If there's a deficit and we have full employment and economic prosperity, then who cares about the deficit? And if we have a balanced budget and the economy is terrible, then so it's distinguishing the means and the ends. And so Lerner actually participated in a symposium about instrumentalism, and basically signed on, said, this is how we do what's done. Yeah. So Lowe wrote, instrumental analysis is a search procedure and a mental technique of problem solving in which solutions are discovered or hit upon through what Michael Polanyi calls a logical leap. but they're not leaps in the dark. Our search is guided by past experience, analogies, and other clues, yet it remains true that our ultimate insight springs from a non-rational act of imagination. So, non-rational, of course, rationality is not only central to mainstream economics, but rational planning, rational economic planning, sometimes called optimal planning, which is, it's basically using neoclassical tools to try to apply to a centrally planned economy. And the Soviet Union, I mean, that was their approach, was rational planning or optimal planning. But there are many alternative approaches to planning that are not simply rational or optimal planning. There are no binding rules according to which the researcher could decide in favor of one among many possible hypotheses, which one she chooses in the end. Adopting Einstein's free creation of the mind is neither a strictly determinable nor an arbitrary decision. The researcher senses a structural relationship between the hypothesis she chooses and the problem she wants to solve. So I know this almost can start to sound a bit, it's not usually the areas that economists are delving into so much. But in a wide variety of fields, whether it's the physician with a medical diagnosis, the scientist with, scientific discovery, and artists with, creativity. And also we have this quote: in solving a problem of this sort, the grand thing is to be able to reason backward. That is a very useful accomplishment, a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. In the everyday affairs of life, it's more useful to reason forward, and so the other comes to be neglected. There are 50 who can reason synthetically, working forward, for one who can reason analytically, and so on. I was so surprised when I first read these words, when I took a break from my research to read a little Sherlock Holmes. And there is a bunch of discussion about Holmes and retroduction, but not really any elaboration in connection with the ideas of Polya or Polanyi. In the famous novel, The Sign of Four, the only point in the case which deserved mention was the curious analytical reasoning from effects to causes by which I succeeded in unraveling it. So, detection, just problem solving is basically what we're talking about. Methods of problem solving. And also Conan Doyle, who was trained as a doctor, and used to talk about one of his teachers kind of doing these kinds of tricks. If you're familiar with Sherlock Holmes, because he skips all of the chains linking, short chains of inference, when he just goes from one to the result, like saying to Watson, I've seen you've been in Afghanistan, right? And it doesn't understand how he knew, right? But once he explains it, it's actually a logical series of inferences. Yes, before Sherlock Holmes, there was Auguste Dupin, the detective in Edgar Allan Poe's mystery or stories of criminal detection. And so Dupin performs similar types of problem solving. And so in The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Poe describes analysis as the faculty of resolution, retrograde operations, and a posteriori reasoning, right? So, and then just as Holmes's references to cold calculation and false claims that he never guesses can lead us to forget his own emphasis on the imagination. He remarked once, how often is imagination the mother of truth? Poe's term ratiocination also can blind us to the interplay of logical inference and poetic imagination. And so Poe insists to calculate is not in itself to analyze, and analytical power should not be confounded with simple ingenuity. And Poe also has an interesting comment. It's sort of like the fallacy of composition. A reason deduced from mathematical study often makes the mistake of assuming or perceiving things as if the aggregated parts are equal to the whole, right? And this results from failing to distinguish between analysis and algebra, mere mathematical reason alone. As poet and mathematician, one would reason well. As mere mathematician, one could not have reasoned at all. The truly imaginative are never other than analytic. So, Polanyi has this quote, which I think sums up the kind of paradoxical nature of creative discovery in many fields. So genius is known for two faculties which may seem incompatible. On the one hand, genius is a gift of inspiration. Scientists back to Archimedes have acknowledged the coming of a bright idea. But we have ample evidence of an opposite kind. Genius has been said to consist of taking infinite pains, and all kinds of creative pursuits are, in fact, extremely strenuous. Is there any hard work which will induce an inspiration to visit us? We make a discovery, and yet it comes as a surprise to us. So, I mean, this is the I think the part that rather than creative discoveries or works of genius being simply a spontaneous inspiration, that hard work, there are things that we can do that imagination and these other kinds of guessing, these other kinds of things that scientists don't like to discuss in their papers, but in their diaries and journals and letters and so on, we know that all these things like following a hunch and guessing and imagination are central to the scientific discovery process. And just a couple examples. I've never heard of anyone stumbling onto something sitting down. Chance favors those in motion. So, being active, meeting lots of different people, reading widely in many different areas, all of these kinds of things can assist in inviting what C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination, but we could call the interdisciplinary imagination, or the economic imagination. Chance favors the prepared mind. So what unites all these different activities that employ these powers of creative discovery? The quest, the discovery process, following the clues, imaginative guesswork, seeking to solve the mystery, to find the coherence among the parts, creatively searching for solutions. And so Polanyi and Mills just talking about reorganizing the researcher's file. Every once in a while, Mills is writing in the 1950s, so it's before our files were on our computers, but he's saying, take out your files and put them on the floor and mix them all up and then reorganize them with a mind oriented toward making connections between authors or ideas that previously had not been associated with one another. That this is one of the practical methods for inviting the sociological imagination. So there's this appendix to C. Wright Mills' book, The Sociological Imagination, called On Intellectual Craftsmanship, where this is discussed. And I encourage everybody, it's also appropriate for, undergraduates as well. Ransacking our memory for a similar problem, right? An analogous problem that was solved, getting a comparative grip on the materials, looking for favorable signs that are not proof, but encourage further investigation. And Polanyi even argued that just our awareness of the capacity to sense the accessibility of a hidden inference and the ability to invent transformations of the premises which would increase accessibility, themselves can bias our guesses in the right direction. So the whole process of discovery and confirmation ultimately relies on our own crediting of our own vision. So the way of discovery, curiosity, not utility, is the master key to human knowledge. Curiosity, which may or may not result in something useful. And the less that curiosity is asked to justify itself day by day, the more likely it is not only to contribute to human welfare, but to the equally important satisfaction of the human mind. So I think that is a good place. The most important work is done with the scientific use of the imagination, but we have always some material basis on which to start our speculation. That was actually, something that distinguished Lowe from Keynes, when it comes to the issue of the uncertainty of investor expectations. Keynes and even some Austrian economics recognize something like fundamental uncertainty, but Lowe wanted to identify the objective conditions or the structural conditions that determine uncertainty. And one of the things is the longer into the future we have to form expectations about, the more unexpected things that can occur, and therefore the greater the uncertainty, ceteris paribus. So Lowe argued that in the transformation from an earlier capitalism of family firms and family farms to mass production, the length of the production period was lengthened, more capital intensive and higher fixed costs and so on. And therefore, the greater the length of the time horizon, the greater the uncertainty. So trying to identify the material basis for economic behaviors and motivations. Behavior and motivation were the most difficult areas. And in neoclassical economics, motivation and behavior are treated as though they have a one-to-one correspondence, or what is the same thing, the two are conflated. So it's basically sociology 101 that a single motivation can result in different behaviors, and different motivations can result in the same behavior. There is, it's sometimes called the many problem. So there is no one-to-one correspondence, and that's partly what makes that stage of the planning process very challenging when it comes to the behaviors and the motivations. But the first task is identifying the structural and technological paths that are capable of taking us where we want to go, towards the vision of our desired set of goals to a future, more sustainable, more just society that provides adequate material provisioning for everyone. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I went a little bit longer, Ruchira, than we said, but I think we should still have a good amount of time for discussion and Q&A.
We have plenty time, and I can see that there's lots of people come in, and there's obviously a lot of excitement. And whoever is there, please put your comments and questions in the chat box. And until you do, I'm going to take full liberty to monopolize the discussion. So with that word of warning, I will now begin. Okay, I'm going to begin with something Matt said earlier when we were discussing how to do this talk. He said history of thought is not just about admiring antique furniture. And I quite enjoyed that, because that's something also one of the founding members of ISHED, Alex, had said earlier, that history of thought is a way of doing economics, actually doing something. So we use the history of thought as a way to understand something. And the purpose of this talk and the many talks we will have from henceforth is to understand how can the history of economic thought give us methods to theorize about problem solving about the economy. And in a way, what Matt has done essentially is to talk about how the poet and the mathematician must come together, so that an imagination is always analytical. Now, I'm going to begin, of course, with my first question on experience. And it seems rather obvious, it shouldn't be so radical that experience, plays a role in determining rationality. And yet, this is something that not only neoclassical economics, but most of heterodox economists have also not recognized. The few people who do seem to recognize it are the feminist economists, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And they then look at how experience can make us understand a different idea of rationality, where they bring in standpoint rationality or alternate ideas of rationality. Is there something that the feminist movement can draw from the work of Loeb, Polya, Polanyi, Pierce? Over to you, Matt.
Thank you so much. I feel that there is, and so it's very much sort of another set of issues where we can identify the challenges, the problems, and to some extent the goals. And I think the way that feminist economics broadened the scope of inquiry, which previously had, and still to some extent, excluded huge areas of essential labor and, of course, the emphasis on care and so on, that that not only wage labor, but also, household labor, not only market activity or money activity, but also the much work that's done in the household and in the community and so on. And so I feel like, yes, there are a number of insights that we gained, and I think probably someone could, look at the development of feminist economics or, ecological economics, Black political economy, and so on. Maybe some of the, lesser known heterodox approaches. Feminist, of course, has, you no longer can say feminist economics is lesser known. But I think the answer is yes, and that one of the things that feminist economics very much emphasized, and you see this in the work of people like Sandra Harding, who's of course a philosopher, not an economist, but and then others, is that oppositional pairs that we usually perceive, male, female, Black, white, and so on and so forth, that instead of looking at these as a kind of hierarchical dualism, that these are seen as more complementary and not so opposed, where one member of the pair is has power over the other. So you'd see that come up. I mean, I think maybe Julie Nelson and some of the ecofeminist authors, ecological feminists, social ecofeminism, I think have also, and I think that because logic and the imagination and these, instead of perceiving them as opposed and either or, that both play a role, but either one alone, maybe not quite sufficient.
Quite right. We have a question from Connor Howell. He says, Dr. Forstater, could you provide a concrete example of an instance where you or another economist have applied by this approach? I would take the low Polanyi-Pearce approach.
Right. So, well, so Lowe himself, he used actually a three-sector model, which was, if you're familiar with Marx's schemes of reproduction, say, where you have a capital goods sector and a consumption goods sector, then Lowe and colleagues in the 1920s, they split the capital goods sector into two, producing capital goods for the capital goods producing sectors, and one producing capital goods for the consumption goods sector. And you know, for practical policy work and economic planning, then input output frameworks are indispensable. And Leontief, by the way, was a colleague of Lowe at Kiel University, where Leontief was, it was sort of like a pre-doctoral fellowship, because Leontief was getting his doctorate, from a university in Russia, and but he was in residence at Kiel, where Lowe was the research director. So input output, but for theoretical and analytical purposes, you don't have to have, the full-blown input-output model. Even just one step of disaggregation from, say, the Keynes consumption plus investment, and you can see all the different obstacles to an economy reproducing itself, basically. And so what Lowe did was, he took this three-sector model and he asks the question, so if our goal is full employment, then if the economy were running at full employment, how would it respond to structural and technological changes, like labor displacing technological change, or changes in labor supply, and of course, natural resource supplies throws another, brings up another set of issues with this. But he wasn't assuming full employment or a tendency to full employment. But if you only work forwards from an economy with unemployment and excess capacity, then you don't see all the obstacles that arise when you're at full employment, because excess capacity and unemployment give the system a certain kind of flexibility. It's the idea behind the reserve army and the functionality of unemployment and excess capacity. And so when the economy is at full employment, and let's just to drive the point home, say also full capacity utilization. So full employment, full capacity utilization, any change in capital labor ratios in the sectors or labor supply, the system is so rigid that it will respond in a very sluggish way. It could give rise to rising prices because you get these bottlenecks in production, right? Where you have, the steel sector is running at full blast, so you can't increase output in the automobile sector because, right? And you see what, so even if we can attain full employment through, say, short-term Keynesian stimulus, maintaining full employment in the face of these changes. So that was an example that he's used, a number of times in his work. And then later, like especially in the 1970s, with greater information about environmental challenges coming to the fore, then those issues also, to a certain extent, these kind of tighten up, because when you have, say, you have to meet certain conditions for sustainability, certain sustainability rules, for example, regarding the relation of, use of renewable resource per time period in relation to its rate of renewal, the emissions in relation to the sum of capacity, and so on. Then those are given, and then the analysis, comes. And also, a lot of my ideas, and also I think, my students have also taken this on, that research is not just, reading a book. It can be a conversation at the coffee shop. It could be overhearing something on the radio or on television that reminds you of something else. It could be, in other words, 24/7, our experience is an ongoing ongoing process of material for us. And so, yeah, I think I think yeah, Connor Howell is one of our students at UMKC, and so happy that you can make it, Connor.
Well, thanks for coming, Connor. It must be very early for you. We have Charmin next. She has a question. Charmin, can you unmute yourself and you can turn on your camera?
Yeah. Hi. So thanks a lot, Mathew, for that really interesting and engaging talk. In fact, I was not even I didn't expect to hear it. It's very interesting when we get in these perspectives coming in from literature, and especially this word imagination is quite fascinating and I mean it kind of goes to completely disrupt what we consider conventionally to be rationality in economics. I mean, I don't think the idea of rationality is as deeply entrenched in any of the social sciences or social studies as, say, economics, especially. So as I was listening to as I was listening to all these things, I mean, of course, you're talking about, I think, from Lowe and Polanyi and all onwards, it's about mid 20th century, but it was reminding me of almost 100 years earlier. I think during say 19th century, when the political economists were having there used to be those discussions on, say, whether economics is an art or a science. There used to be that old thing, and I was wondering what may be the connections to that. I think that's not really a question that's any longer really taken up in economics classrooms and all, but I also encountered these debates happening when I look at my own primary materials, which are from early 20th century Indian economists who are trying to shape up a discipline of economics for India. I mean, not a separate framework, but something to make it more relevant to national needs and all of that. So there, it's very interesting. I see how the science of economics and all, and I guess taking more from J.S. Mill's kind of formulations becomes about
Yes.
having a specific kind of scientific method and and not really going into deeper political speculation as well. While I see from the Indian economist side, I mean, this is a early 20th century that I'm seeing. They're also saying, well, we should also see it as an art, because and with the art, I think they're also trying to. This is kind of the nationalist and government or colonial sponsored economists in India who are kind of at loggerheads in that sense. By promoting the idea of the art of economics, I think they're trying to also bring up the idea of something like normative economics. So more open speaking about how things should be, how they can be, rather than simply studying what is. So I was seeing that kind of a difference also. I mean, I don't know how the particular thing that you're talking about here and the idea of retroduction, and especially this, what we call as instrumental inference.
Yes.
How that fits in with even those earlier concerns within economics, or when we can say when the political economists were really at work rather than before they were called economists. So yeah, if you have anything on that.
Yes. Well, yes, absolutely. I appreciate everything you've said. And so we could even go back to Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, his lesser known, but, very important work that some consider necessary for really understanding also the wealth of nations, that it was part of Smith's, life project. And so the imagination is one of the indispensable parts of what Smith's describing in the theory of moral sentiments, where he identified sympathy, what we would call empathy, as the social cement necessary for a well-functioning society. And so it was about you had to imagine what it would be like if you were in the situation that you're observing, to put yourself in another's shoes, which requires the imagination, right? We're imagining, Smith says, like if you're not the one who's on the rack, right, which was like a torture device, then you're kind of squirming, watching, but you're not the one who's being tortured. And but through our imagination, we ask, and then the other part is imagining if we were the other person looking back at us, how would we approve or disapprove of another's behavior? And this was part of. So, and then Lowe did give examples from Smith and Marx and John Stuart Mill, and also to a certain extent Keynes, Schumpeter, who are not, part of classical political economy, but have certain commonalities, perhaps with methodology, with the true classical authors, not neoclassical, but the classical authors. So, absolutely, I think it's very much connected to this idea of the art of economics, or the art of social inquiry, the art of economic policy. So absolutely.
Thanks, Shalmin, for that very insightful question, and Matt for the thoughts. I had full plans of monopolizing this discussion. Unfortunately, I can't, because there are lots of questions coming in from the audience. We have one, and new friends and old. So we have questions from Ramesh Kumar and Kalpana Khanal. Kalpana, I'll come to you in a minute. Ramesh first, he says, "Sir, can you tell me a little bit about what are the dynamics of class struggle in the labor market?" And I'll add to it and say, what would Lowe, Pierce, Polanyi have to say about that?
Right. So, I mean, socioeconomic class was the unit of analysis for Lowe, as in the classical and Marxian, literature, or even Koletsky, or in other words, you have Lowe's analytical work was very complementary to the work developing Sraffa's production of commodities, that whereas Sraffa was focusing on value and distribution, Lowe was focusing on technical change, accumulation, but I mean, yes, as in the classical authors in Marx, you have capitalists and workers, and class exploitation, and I mean, Lowe was not focused on perhaps revolutionary class politics, but one of the things that kind of connects also to Sharman and Connor's questions as well as this one is that I came to this idea of the job guarantee program from a different route than a lot of my colleagues, for whom a more Keynesian, highly aggregate models like national income equation or your, you know, your basic macroeconomic injections equal macroeconomic leakages, right? I plus G plus X equals S plus T plus M. And so Lowe, he was focused on more inter-industry relationships. And so the job guarantee program is, again, if you're working forward, then, you know, say government spending is going up and there was unemployment, and so you're going to have employment increasing to a certain degree, but then you have these issues that I raised about a rigidity of the economy when it's at full employment. And I mean, it's all about this question of unemployment is considered, you know, the number one problem in a capitalist economy. And when the Keynesian view that, yes, unemployment is normal, but it's irrational, right? And so Keynes thought that we just had to have policy and move the economy to full employment. Marx, Koletsky, and Lowe as well recognize the functionality of unemployment and excess capacity. That means that even if we had some policy to move the economy to full employment, that the problem is that we're unable, right? When you get to full employment, the system is unable to respond to these kind of structural and technological changes because you have to deal with this loss of the functionality, right? I mean, of course, we can also be thinking about post-capitalist possibilities, which you know, Lowe very much was. But I think the challenge of how could such a thing as a full employment capitalism exist, even setting aside the environmental and other issues. And so that's where this idea of kind of strategic public sector employment activity that you kind of employ the reserve army, so to speak. So instead of moving between employment and unemployment, you have full employment, but perhaps people moving between the private sector or the regular public sector and this job guarantee, sector. So there's a lot of issues involved there, but the very first things that I wrote when I got involved with what came to be known as MMT was about these structural and technological aspects and the ways in which Lowe had a job guarantee proposal under a different name, but one of his primary points was that because government or public sector activity is not for profit, then the technologies that are utilized and the activities that are undertaken can be selected using not private sector efficiency criteria, but instead broader macroeconomic, social, or environmental goals. And so, even say almost pure services that use almost no capital goods and that use fewer or no exhaustible natural resources, or that don't pollute as much, right? We have the flexibility in the public sector to make these decisions, whereas in the private sector, firms are generally under the sway of the competitive pressures that determine the technologies that are utilized and the resources and pollution. And of course, this is where, regulation and so on would come into play. But yeah, you do have, although it's not the primary focus, certainly a focus on workers, not only in the traditional sense, but also, the 99% of us.
Thanks, Matt, for doing lots of justice to Ramesh's question. I now have my two old friends. One first, Kalpana. She says, "Hi, Matt, great to listen to your lecture after a while. My question is this alternative methodology, which is the Lowe methodology, is it applicable to policy research?"
Yes, I mean, so the title of the first piece I wrote on instrumentalism was the subtitle was Instrumental Inference as a Policy Discovery Procedure. And this was a little bit tongue-in-cheek because, Hayek had a famous piece called, Competition as a Discovery Procedure. And the Austrian analysis of the entrepreneur as kind of like an imaginative discoverer, right? That's responding to these market signals and so on. So it has, been discussed in that context, but policy and planning absolutely is what it's all, what this is, the purpose of Lowe's instrumentalism is for analytical work in the field of public policy and an alternative approach to economic planning. And so, you know, whether it's environmental problems or worker health and safety issues, and agriculture, infrastructure revitalization, I mean, you know, whatever it might be, then so we have these tools. And so, you know, how do we come up with new ideas in the face of, you know, one of my students calls wicked problems, or, you know, right? And, you know, we have to use all of the resources at our disposal for taking on, you know, some issues like, I mean, with obviously climate and I mean, you take a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal as, for example, I mean, this this methodology, I consider to be a methodology of economic policy formulation. And then, you know, of course, it's an iterative process that once, you know, we start, you know, working backwards, or once we start putting the plan into motion, then, you know, new information or new feedbacks will arise, and then we will make adjustments right along the way, modifying as necessary, and to try to you know, attain the goals that we set out. I mean, by the way, ecological economics, I discovered, and I have another paper. It was in the journal Ecological Economics, called Visions and Scenarios, and it basically, you know, introduces these ideas I've been discussing today in specifically with regard to ecological economics, which arose in the around the early 90s as an alternative, a transdisciplinary alternative to mainstream environmental economics. So ecological economics emphasizes envisioning, so that we must we have to envision the sustainable society, you know, that we want to create. And, you know, without a vision of where we want to go, right? Lerner, he had his first article about functional finance was called The Economic Steering Wheel. And he was saying that, like, well, now we have driverless cars, but he was saying, you know, you can't stay on the road if you aren't driving the car. And then here, I think we would add, you also need to know your destination, right? Where are we going? We're not just driving aimlessly, right? But we have the direction in which we want to go. And I mean, this is obviously, it's just crucially important in today's world that we envision alternatives to the nightmarish realities that could be a possible future. And so for the sake of our children and the sake of the earth, we have to come up with the alternative visions and then roll up our sleeves and get down to the nitty-gritty analytical work. That's that is also where this plays a role, not just a grand vision, but then step by step, how are we going to get there?
All right, I will take the last question, and then I'll have like a few things to say. But I mean, it's so good to have you after so long. And Kalpana is also saying, thank you, Matt, appreciate it. So last question is from Vishal. And, thank you to everybody who has stayed till now. I know it is very early in the US, and I think many people have just gone to start their work day Monday morning. And in India, it's the end of a very long work day with Independence Day weekend coming up. So I really appreciate those who stayed till now. But Vishal has a question now. He says, Low and Mahalanobis, could you illuminate more on that?
Right. So thank you so much for mentioning that. And this also relates to one of the earlier questions as well. I think from Sharman, early 20th century, Indian economics. So Mahalanobis, such an important figure in the Indian planning, tradition. So Mahalanobis, independently from Low, developed a similar three-sector model where you have the capital goods sector split into two, and the sector one, or sector 1A, which is the capital goods producing sector for the capital goods industries. So he was probably influenced, Mahalanobis, in this three sector by the Soviet economist Feldman. So Feldman also had this, and you will see occasionally this. Now, there are others who split the consumption goods sector into two, right? And I once asked someone who has contributed a lot to this. This is sometimes discussed under the heading of the theory of the traverse, which is the movement from one steady state growth path to another, right? And so what happens in between? John Hicks did work. He actually gave it the name traverse, this analysis of the disequilibrium movements of the system. So you had Mahalanobis. Then you also had Sukhomoy Chakravarti, apologize for my pronunciation, but so Chakravarti uh, also was concerned with, development planning and with structural and technological change, and explicitly adopted instrumentalism as a methodological approach. And you can find in Chakravarti's also Gautam Mathur, right? Mathur, also embraced instrumentalism among Indian economists. And so, and then the connection to some of the others in the sort of heterodox economic planning tradition, like Clive Thomas and Justinian Royamu, is what Sraffa called the basic goods sector, which Lowe and Mahalanobis identify as the machine tools sector, right? So your machines and tools that are producing machines and tools. And this, it's widely known that in industrialization, this is a key, the machine tools sector is a fundamental key, and if you're at full employment, right, you cannot expand consumption or the rate of growth of output in in the consumption goods sector, unless you produce more capital goods for the consumption goods industry. To produce more capital goods for the consumption goods industry, you have to produce more capital goods for the capital goods industry. And so you could, move some capital goods from sector one to sector two, but that's going to ultimately lower your rate of growth, because you're doing that at the expense of producing more capital goods in the machine tools sector. So you can get these bottlenecks in production, and of course these become more difficult at very high levels of employment and capacity utilization. And I think one of the really interesting questions is in the transition from earlier 20th century mass production systems to sort of the information technology revolution and the microelectronic revolution. I mean, you need chips to create chips, I suppose. So you have a kind of, computers are going to be like a basic, right? It's going to be an input in directly and indirectly into all other commodities. So I think, whether one questions the desirability of, endless economic growth, and is interested in exploring, zero growth or degrowth, or these sorts of models are indispensable. It's not only for looking at, traditional growth. And likewise, I think that many of the questions that we are facing and we're going to be facing in the future also are many of the analytical approaches and methodological approaches we're discussing still have something to contribute to our current, especially when we're talking about a Green New Deal type, that must entail a transformation in the technological structure of production from one based on fossil fuels to one based on renewables. I mean, we must. And of course, there are, right, a lot of other, but basically, we cannot either, continue to have a system based on fossil fuels, or with the emissions and the damage that is causing with all of the harmful health effects. So, India right now, I mean, with the continued economic growth and many, anticipations about the Indian economy over the next, century, say, or even the next 30 years, there's a tremendous amount of these kinds of challenges that are going to be faced. And so I think it's going to take, our collective wisdom and alternative approaches are going to be absolutely indispensable.
Thanks a lot, Matt. For closing remarks, so our History and Methods in Political Economy series is going to continue. On the 27th of August at 5 p.m., we have a talk by Keith Tribe on constructing economic science, the invention of a discipline. It's also his book, so it's kind of like a book talk. It might be a bit too early for our American audience, but I hope the Indian audience and Kalpana from Nepal and others can please join in. And Sharbin and I will continue inviting many scholars around the world to come and talk to all of us. So please feel free to join in. And thanks a lot, Matt, for being the first of our History and Methods in Political Economy series. I couldn't have, it couldn't be better. And I'm so grateful to the internet, because this is one way to, I don't have to get you on an Air India flight and drag you for 18 hours. I get to talk to you from my study. So that's so wonderful. Thanks a lot.
And I thank you so much, and to everyone. And I hope that this is, not a culmination, but it is a new beginning, not only for ideas and for ISHET, but also collaboration between UMKC and your organizations and universities, and just very excited for, what kinds of formal and informal collaborations we can have going forward.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. I will end the call. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you so
Thanks a lot.
much.
Yeah.
I gotta see.
Yes. Yeah, I think the talk and all, it's officially has come to an end. So, right. So yes, and thank you to everyone else as well who's attended here today. Right.